"Say that again," he said, voice low and deliberate, like the calm before a storm. I froze behind the wheel of my beat-up Civic, rain slapping against the windshield in a relentless rhythm that made the city streets look like a blurred watercolor. My hands trembled on the wheel, gripping it so tight I could feel my knuckles turn white. The rearview mirror reflected headlights too close, too threatening, and I knew without looking that it was him. Derek Blackwood, the man whose name alone whispered danger, standing taller than any streetlight, tailored black suit slick with rain, eyes locking onto mine as if he could see every thought running through my mind. I cursed under my breath, turning sharply onto a narrow side street, tires slipping on wet asphalt, heart pounding like a drum in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The SUV's engine followed me, a shadow of power and precision, and for a moment, I imagined I could outrun him, maybe even disappear into the maze of back alleys, but instinct screamed that it wasn't possible. My eyes caught on a puddle reflecting the neon signs above, and for the briefest second, I saw him as a predator, patient and calculating, waiting for the exact moment I'd falter. Then he was beside me, the SUV door opening with a quiet authority that made the world seem to hold its breath. He stepped out, a tall figure cutting through the rain like a blade, and the city's chaos seemed to fade around him. My fingers trembled, but my voice was caught somewhere between fear and disbelief as he leaned slightly, nailing me with a gaze that was impossible to escape, and said, "Say that again," this time looking at me. I could feel every drop of rain, every heartbeat, every pulse of adrenaline hammering through me. My mouth opened, words trapped, but finally, a whisper escaped, "So hot." He tilted his head, the barest hint of a grin playing on his lips, eyes locking onto mine with a precision that made my stomach drop. The world around us dissolved into the wet streets, the blurred lights, the endless hum of the city, leaving only the two of us, the space between us electric with tension. I wanted to move, to step back, but my feet were rooted, every instinct screaming at me, every nerve alight with awareness of his control, his presence, the undeniable authority he carried in every measured movement. He didn't rush, didn't raise a hand, but the aura of him pressed closer, and I knew in that moment that this wasn't about force, it was about inevitability, the quiet, unshakable certainty that he owned the moment, and somehow, in that claim, he owned a part of me too. My breath hitched as he straightened, the subtle shift of his weight, the faint scent of expensive cologne mingling with the storm around us, and I realized I had been caught in a current far stronger than the rain, the darkened streets, or the fear that had driven me here. He smiled, not cruelly, but with an awareness that made my pulse spike, and said, exactly like that, "Don't look away." Every fiber of me wanted to resist, to flee, but curiosity, adrenaline, and something deeper, something that whispered of the power he held, kept me frozen, and the storm became a backdrop to a single truth: I was no longer just a girl running through the rain. I was part of his world, and for better or worse, it was only beginning. The rain continued to hammer the streets as I followed Derek Blackwood, walking with an almost unnatural grace that made my steps feel clumsy in comparison. The streetlights reflected in the puddles, distorting our silhouettes, and each time I glanced up, his gaze seemed to track me with unerring precision, calm yet commanding. I tried to steady my breathing, to convince myself that nothing had really changed, but the weight of his presence pressed into my chest, making each inhale shallow and deliberate. We turned a corner, the hum of traffic fading, leaving only the patter of rain and the subtle click of his polished shoes on wet asphalt. The buildings loomed on either side, tall and impassive, but his attention made the entire city shrink into a narrow path just wide enough for us, a tunnel of intensity. I kept my hands in my coat pockets, gripping the edges so tightly that my nails bit into my palms, my mind racing through possible excuses, possible ways to escape the awareness of being so fully seen. He did not speak, did not gesture, only walked beside me, the softest smirk hinting at the edges of his mouth, a question that I could not answer yet understood anyway. My eyes flicked to the dark windows of the buildings, imagining shadows watching us, unaware that the real gravity was in the space between us, the electric tension that seemed to coil tighter with every step. A sudden gust of wind whipped across the street, making me shiver and pulling my coat tighter around me, and for the first time I felt the contrast starkly, my smallness against his measured composure, my unease against his unshakable certainty. We reached the entrance of a dimly lit café tucked into the corner of the street, its warm glow spilling onto the sidewalk. Derek paused at the door, hand on the handle, and finally spoke, voice low but rich with authority. "You understand that looking away is optional, but noticing is mandatory." I swallowed hard, feeling the heat rise to my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the undeniable awareness that my every movement, every glance, every subtle shift in posture was catalogued, considered, acknowledged. He stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter first, and I hesitated only a moment before pushing the door open, the scent of coffee and pastry mingling with the damp air. Inside, the hum of conversation and clinking cups seemed distant, muted against the internal rhythm of our silent interaction. He followed, precise and deliberate, the distance between us shrinking without effort, and I felt a pull I could not name, a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and an unspoken understanding that the path I had walked so far had led here, to this intersection of ordinary life and the extraordinary gravity he carried with him. We found a table near the window, overlooking the rain-slicked street, and he seated himself opposite me, posture straight, eyes unblinking, radiating the calm authority that had first made my pulse quicken outside. I placed my hands on the table, tracing the edge of the wooden surface, grounding myself, and he watched, leaning slightly forward, not to intimidate, but to mark presence, to convey with the subtlest of gestures that he held the space, the moment, the interaction entirely in his hands. The café became a stage of quiet intensity, the ordinary world around us fading into background as each breath, each blink, each small movement carried weight. I realized then, not for the first time, that my initial resistance, my fleeting attempts at control, were already secondary to the undeniable pull of his command. The storm outside mirrored the tension within, but in this controlled chaos, I began to recognize the strange comfort of clarity. He knew the rules, the boundaries, and yet allowed me enough space to navigate them, a dance of presence and observation that demanded nothing less than my full attention, and I could not look away. The steam from the coffee cups curled in lazy spirals between us, the warmth of the café wrapping around my shoulders as if it could shield me from the intensity of his gaze. Derek Blackwood did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough for me to feel every heartbeat echo in my chest. Outside, the rain continued to drum steadily on the pavement, but inside, the ordinary hum of conversation was muted beneath the gravity of our shared space. I kept my hands lightly clasped on the table, tracing the outline of the wood grain with subtle movements, aware that each shift, each small gesture, was observed and catalogued. Derek leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, eyes never leaving mine, the faintest curl of his lips suggesting amusement, patience, and a promise I could not yet decipher. I tried to focus on my coffee, letting the rich aroma fill my senses, but the warmth did little to calm the rush of adrenaline and awareness that he carried with him, a presence so commanding it bent the atmosphere around us. My mind raced with questions, but the words caught in my throat, leaving only the steady pull of his eyes, a magnetic force I could not resist. I realized that the careful rhythm of his observation was teaching me something unspoken, that the power he held was not in loud proclamations or overt actions, but in subtlety, in the quiet certainty that he could read every nuance, every fleeting thought. I sipped my coffee slowly, letting it ground me, and yet my awareness never wavered, knowing that even as I took each breath, Derek was noting the rise and fall of my chest, the slight twitch of my fingers, the way my gaze shifted involuntarily toward the window and back again. The world beyond the glass was a blur of reflections, neon lights smeared across wet asphalt, but here, at this table, time seemed to slow, stretching each moment into something almost tangible, a current that pulled me forward without direction, without need for explanation. A waiter passed with a tray of pastries, and I caught Derek's subtle glance, a silent acknowledgement that nothing escaped him, not even the mundane act of another person moving through our shared space. I felt a shiver of recognition, not fear, not threat, but understanding of the unspoken rules in place, the rhythm that governed our interaction, delicate yet firm, a dance of observation and subtle assertion. He finally spoke, voice soft but measured, cutting through the low murmur of the café. Notice everything, Emily. You cannot hide what is seen. The words were neither command nor request, merely a statement of fact, and I found myself nodding slightly, not out of submission, but out of recognition that this moment had already set a tone I could not ignore. The rain outside seemed to fade, the city sounds dimming as if respecting the quiet authority he carried effortlessly, and I understood that what had begun as a casual meeting had shifted into a study of presence, of control, of a power that was both invisible and undeniable. I lifted my gaze to his, seeing the faint reflection of streetlights in the stormy depths of his eyes, and realized that I was learning the unspoken language of his world, one measured glance, one controlled gesture at a time, and I could not look away, nor did I want to. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle by the time we left the café, and the streetlights cast long reflections across the wet asphalt, shimmering like molten gold in the puddles. Derek Blackwood walked beside me, his presence a constant reminder of the invisible weight he carried, the kind of authority that needed no words to assert itself. I kept my gaze forward, careful not to flinch, but every so often I could feel the quiet pressure of his eyes on me, assessing, noting, commanding without ever raising his voice. My coat was damp, clinging lightly to my shoulders, but the chill was less of a concern than the flutter of awareness that his proximity elicited, a mixture of apprehension and fascination that I had not anticipated. We turned into a side street lined with small shops, their neon signs flickering as the wind shifted, and I realized that the ordinary cityscape felt transformed, filtered through the lens of the attention he lavished on every detail. I tried to slow my thoughts, to focus on the mundane, the uneven pavement beneath my shoes, the distant hum of a delivery truck, but Derek's presence pulled my mind into a single, intense focus, the rhythm of his steps a steady drum beside my own, and I could not look away from the subtle cues he offered with posture, gesture, the faint twitch of a finger, the way his shadow stretched across the sidewalk. As we walked, he finally spoke, voice calm and measured, "Emily, there is no need to pretend the ordinary is enough when you see how the extraordinary moves through the world." I swallowed, feeling the weight of those words settle in my chest, not as a reprimand but as an invitation, a challenge I could not yet articulate, the pull of his authority threading through the space between us, drawing me into a current I had not chosen but could not resist. A light fog began to drift along the street, softening the edges of the buildings, and in that haze, our reflections on the wet pavement merged into something almost seamless, a visual metaphor for the growing tension, the careful, unspoken negotiation of presence and control that marked every step of this walk. I felt my pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the awareness that each glance, each measured pause, each small motion was part of a silent dialogue we were conducting without words, the city around us fading into a background hum as the focus narrowed entirely to the exchange of attention, acknowledgement, and subtle assertion. He stopped outside a small, elegantly understated building, the brass letters catching the dim glow of the streetlights, and gestured toward the entrance, a simple movement imbued with the same quiet command he had carried from the moment we met. I nodded, understanding that this was another layer, another step into the rhythm he orchestrated effortlessly, and I stepped inside, the warmth of the interior contrasting sharply with the damp streets behind us. Derek followed, the faint click of his shoes on the polished floor echoing like a metronome, marking the tempo of this carefully controlled interaction, and I realized that the lesson, the tension, the subtle power play, was far from over. Every detail, the hum of the heating, the distant sound of a door closing, the way his gaze lingered just long enough to be felt, was a reminder that I was now part of a dynamic I could neither ignore nor escape, and the awareness of it held me fully present, every sense sharpened, every thought attuned to the quiet authority that guided this encounter. The interior of the building smelled faintly of polished wood and warm paper, the ambient light casting soft reflections across the walls and floor, and I could feel every detail as acutely as if it had been magnified by the attention Derek Blackwood lavished on it. We walked slowly down a narrow hallway, the soft padding of our steps muffled by the thick carpet, and each time I shifted my gaze to the side, I caught him watching the way my fingers grazed the banister, the subtle tension in my shoulders, the way my breathing seemed to alter slightly with each step. The quiet was punctuated only by the distant hum of ventilation and the occasional soft echo of footsteps from another part of the building, but the intensity between us made it feel as though the rest of the world had fallen away entirely. Derek did not speak immediately, his presence a steady force that filled the space, guiding the rhythm of the walk without a single command, and I felt the subtle weight of his authority pressing into the air, unspoken yet undeniable. My mind raced, cataloging everything from the muted scent of leather and faint citrus in the air to the way his shadow stretched across the hallway beside me, but I could not shake the awareness that he was orchestrating every detail of the encounter, the way a conductor might guide a symphony, each note precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. At the end of the hallway, we paused before a large glass door, the soft light behind it hinting at a room furnished with quiet elegance, and Derek rested a hand briefly on the handle, an almost imperceptible gesture that signaled both invitation and control. I hesitated, feeling the hum of anticipation in my chest, and he inclined his head slightly, eyes holding mine with a calm insistence that made the choice to enter seem less like a decision and more like a natural progression of the current between us. As I stepped forward, the air shifted slightly, warmer, yet charged with the same quiet tension that had accompanied every step of our journey, and I realized that this room, this moment, was another stage in the subtle dance he directed, where attention and presence carried more weight than any spoken word. He followed, maintaining a measured distance, the subtle click of his shoes against the floor echoing just enough to reinforce his quiet dominance over the space, and I felt the odd comfort in the structure of it, the way the rules of our interaction had been silently established, leaving me both aware of the power dynamic and yet engaged in it willingly. The room was quiet except for the faint background murmur of the city through the windows, and I allowed myself to notice the details, from the texture of the fabric on the chairs to the precise alignment of objects on a low table, each detail seemingly curated to reinforce the atmosphere of control and order. Derek leaned slightly, not to intimidate, but to guide the energy, the presence he held filling the space between us, and I could feel the pull of it, the quiet insistence that I acknowledge it fully, that I let the awareness of his control shape my perception of the moment. My pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the acute sense of awareness that came with being observed so completely, and yet in that observation, there was no aggression, only the clarity of presence, the subtle but undeniable assertion of authority that had been the through line of every encounter since that rainy night began. I settled into a chair, feeling the contrast between the warmth of the room and the tension in the air, and realized that the interplay of attention, control, and silent communication had already woven a rhythm that I could neither resist nor ignore, a careful choreography that had brought us to this precise moment, and every sense of mine was fully attuned to the quiet power that defined him and, unexpectedly, the way it made me notice myself in relation to him. The soft glow from the table lamp bathed the room in a warm, amber light, highlighting the gentle curves of the furniture and the subtle textures of the walls, and I realized that every detail was purposeful, arranged to convey calm and control, a contrast to the intensity of the connection between Derek Blackwood and me. He moved with measured precision, leaning slightly to adjust a chair as though every small action was part of an unspoken lesson, and I felt the gravity of his presence settle over me like a weight I could not lift, yet strangely, did not want to. My fingers traced the rim of my coffee cup, noting the smooth surface and the faint warmth, grounding me as my mind raced to understand the rhythm of this silent dialogue. Derek's eyes never left mine, calm and unwavering, and with each blink, each subtle tilt of his head, he communicated more than words ever could, a controlled cadence of awareness and authority that required my full attention. Outside, the city continued in its muted chaos, rain streaking the windows with a steady, hypnotic pattern, but within the room, time seemed to slow, every second elongated, stretching the tension into something almost tangible, an invisible thread connecting us in a space that felt entirely removed from the world beyond the walls. I breathed slowly, deliberately, trying to match the rhythm of his presence, and in doing so, found myself becoming acutely aware of the nuances of his movements, the faint exhale that accompanied each subtle shift of posture, the almost imperceptible adjustment of his hands, the way his gaze could linger without pressure yet command the entire moment. My heartbeat settled into a steady cadence, measured against the background of the distant traffic and the whisper of rain, and I realized that the ordinary environment, the table, the cups, the soft light, was now a canvas on which the unspoken exchange of power and observation was being painted. Derek tilted his head slightly, a minimal gesture that carried weight far beyond its simplicity, and he spoke, his voice calm, deliberate, each word chosen with precision. "Pay attention to the details, Emily. The smallest things often reveal the most." I nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding that this was not instruction, but a subtle initiation into the way he experienced and influenced the world around him, a quiet assertion of presence that demanded recognition and comprehension. I felt a mixture of anticipation and fascination, not fear, as the awareness of his control drew my focus inward, heightening every sensation, every thought, every perception of the space, the light, the textures, and most importantly, the rhythm of our interaction. A soft breeze from the slightly open window brought the scent of wet pavement and distant coffee shops into the room, grounding me again, yet I remained captivated, attuned to the nuances of his presence, and realized that each passing moment deepened the unspoken bond of attention and acknowledgement, the silent communication of authority and receptivity that had begun the moment we first met, and I could feel the weight of understanding settling over me, a lesson without words, a connection defined entirely by observation, presence, and the subtle, inescapable gravity of him. The soft light of the room shifted as Derek Blackwood stood and moved to the window, his silhouette outlined against the dim glow of the street beyond, and I found myself watching the subtle strength in his posture, the way he occupied space with a quiet assurance that left no room for doubt about the rhythm he commanded. The rain had ceased, leaving a faint mist clinging to the city outside, and each street lamp reflected in the damp pavement seemed to mirror the meticulous attention he brought to every moment. I remained seated, my hands folded loosely on my lap, aware of the way my body responded to the presence beside and around me, every subtle movement captured by eyes that missed nothing. Derek spoke without turning fully toward me, his voice steady, measured, and imbued with the same calm authority he had carried since the moment we met. "Notice the way the world moves when you are present and observed. It is a lesson in perception, Emily." I nodded slightly, letting the words sink in, understanding that this was not a lecture but a demonstration of the invisible structure of his influence, the careful orchestration of observation and subtle direction that he wielded effortlessly. The air between us seemed to hum with tension, a quiet electricity that was neither oppressive nor threatening, but impossible to ignore, drawing my awareness outward and inward at the same time, attuned to every small shift in light, shadow, and movement. I followed his gaze to the city streets, noting the reflections in the puddles, the gentle sway of a tree in the residual breeze, the distant headlights tracing arcs across intersections, and I realized that he had trained me, in silence, to observe with the precision and attentiveness that he embodied, to read the world with a heightened sense of awareness that extended beyond the ordinary. Derek turned slowly, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that commanded attention without demanding it, and I felt the subtle pull of acknowledgement, the quiet assertion of presence that had been woven into every step of our interaction. Every detail matters, he continued, voice even, calm, deliberate, and the way you notice it reveals the rhythm of the space and the people within it. I absorbed the statement fully, feeling a strange clarity wash over me, the chaos of the city, the residual tension from the rain, the hum of distant life, all refracted through the lens of his attention, shaping my perception and focus. I leaned back slightly, letting the warmth of the room and the measured presence of Derek guide my thoughts, and in that stillness, I understood the subtle dynamic at play. It was not about force or overt dominance, but about control through observation, the silent, exacting influence that shaped every interaction, every awareness, every heartbeat in the space between us. The quiet stretched, but it was not empty. It was charged with the careful calibration of attention and response, the delicate balance of awareness and anticipation that marked our continued exchange, and I felt fully immersed, attuned to every nuance, every subtle signal, every quiet assertion of presence that defined him and, by extension, defined the way I experienced that room, that night, and that intricate moment in the flow of our shared story. The evening deepened, and the soft glow of the interior lights seemed to warm the space, turning the room into a world removed from the bustling city beyond the windows. Derek Blackwood moved with careful deliberation, each step precise, a quiet testament to the control he maintained over both the room and the moment, and I found myself watching, absorbing every detail, every shift in posture, every subtle gesture that conveyed authority without words. The faint hum of the city outside, distant traffic, and the occasional whisper of wind against the glass were all muted beneath the weight of presence that filled the space, making each second feel deliberate and measured. I adjusted in my seat, aware of how every movement I made was noted, not in judgment, but in the silent acknowledgement of awareness, and I felt a heightened sense of perception, attuned to the nuances of light, shadow, and the rhythm of his motions. Derek spoke, voice calm, controlled, resonating with a subtle authority that did not demand attention but commanded it effortlessly. Understanding comes from observing, not just seeing, Emily. The details will tell you what words cannot. I nodded, letting the statement settle, my mind cataloging the textures of the room, the soft reflection of the streetlights on the polished surfaces, the gentle warmth in the air, all filtered through the lens of his observation and influence. Each moment stretched, elongated, filled with the quiet push and pull of presence and acknowledgement, and I became acutely aware of the current between us, the silent exchange that had been established through our shared attention and subtle cues. He tilted his head slightly, a small movement that carried a weight I could feel in the chest, a signal that the moment was measured, considered, and unyielding in its expectation of focus. The way he held the space, the quiet precision of his gestures, and the calm insistence in his eyes created a rhythm I could not ignore, a lesson in presence and awareness that extended beyond the physical environment into the very perception of the world around me. I felt my senses sharpen, the faint scent of leather and faint citrus notes in the air grounding me even as the attention he exerted heightened my perception of every small detail. Outside, the city continued its muted rhythm, but within the room, each heartbeat, each inhale, and each subtle glance became a thread in the intricate web of awareness and control he wove effortlessly. I realized that the influence he carried was not imposed, but offered, a subtle invitation to engage fully with the space, the interaction, and the unspoken rules that guided it, and I could feel myself aligning with the rhythm, attentive, present, and deeply aware of the quiet, undeniable authority that defined him and shaped the course of this evening. The night had deepened, and the room seemed to hold its breath as Derek Blackwood finally moved to stand near the window, the soft glow of the city casting long reflections across the polished surfaces and giving the space an almost surreal stillness. I remained seated, hands lightly resting on my lap, every sense attuned to the subtle cues in his posture, the quiet assurance in the way he occupied the space, and the gentle rhythm of his breathing that seemed to anchor the intensity of the moment. Outside, the streets shimmered with the reflections of streetlights on wet asphalt, a distant echo of the rain that had passed, but inside, the ordinary noises of the city felt muted, as though they had been filtered through the gravity of his presence. Derek turned slightly toward me, eyes steady, voice calm yet carrying the weight of his authority. You have learned to observe, to notice, to understand without being told, and that is the beginning of comprehension, Emily. I nodded, feeling a sense of clarity amidst the heightened awareness, understanding that the careful attention he demanded was not about control for its own sake, but about shaping the way I perceived, interacted with, and responded to the world around me. The warmth of the room, the soft hum of distant city life, and the faint scent of polished wood and leather mingled with the subtle undertone of citrus in the air, grounding me even as the tension of the evening settled into a measured calm. I found my focus drawn to the fine details of the space, the way the light reflected off the surfaces, the alignment of objects, the rhythm of shadows shifting with the movement of a passing car outside, and I understood that every element contributed to the lesson he was imparting without words, a silent, deliberate orchestration of perception and awareness. Derek leaned back slightly, the faintest curl of a smile playing at the corners of his lips, a signal that the interaction was both observation and acknowledgement, and I felt a quiet thrill in recognizing the depth of the exchange, the subtle dynamic that had built over the course of the evening, connecting us in ways that transcended mere conversation. The city beyond the windows continued its muted rhythm, but inside, the space had contracted to the precise focus of the two of us, every glance, every pause, every unspoken gesture contributing to a tapestry of attention and presence that felt both instructive and intimate. I realized that the flow of the evening had created a rhythm, a careful choreography of observation and response, and that I was now part of its cadence, attuned to the quiet gravity he carried, acknowledging it, and participating in it with deliberate awareness. As the final moments stretched, the interplay of light, reflection, and attention drew my gaze to his eyes, and I understood fully that the lesson, the awareness, and the subtle assertion of presence had reached a natural apex, leaving a lingering resonance, a quiet acknowledgement that the interaction had not concluded, but had transformed me, sharpening my senses, focusing my attention, and embedding an understanding of the invisible currents that governed our shared space and the deliberate, unspoken authority that Derek commanded effortlessly.